Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I wanted to start off my talk with a little bit of a story about me and my past. So basically, I was interviewing for this test engineering position. Before this role, I used to be a test engineer, and I was in software testing for about 6 years. And so I was interviewing for this company, and I was very, very nervous, as most people are for interviews. And so I'm answering all these questions pretty well. I think I'm doing well in the interview. And at the end of the interview, the interviewer asked me if I had any questions for him. So I asked him about their staging environment and how the releases work with the different test environments and who's responsible to dump the prod data to staging and all that stuff. And he stopped me and he said that they don't have a staging environment. They test in production. And I was so shocked. I was so confused. I was like, what do you mean you test in production? Like, people don't do this. Like, I had no idea that this was a practice. And he could see that I was confused. So he asked me to do something, and I would like all of you to do it now. So I want everyone to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Okay, everyone's got it. You're thinking about it. Is it working right now in production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you and your alarms haven't gone off, so you assume that it's working, right? But you don't know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working in production right now. And when I say testing in production, I mean testing your features in the environment where your features will live and not using a dummy environment like staging or QA or something like that. So it's what's important to remember is that it's not a replacement for all testing, and we're going to talk about scope a little bit later, but it's also not the end of the world, and we're going to walk through a little bit of these risks a little bit so you get a better understanding. So most companies and all the companies that I had worked for previously use a test environment, right, or a staging environment. Can you guys send like a thumbs up or some sort of reaction if you guys use a test environment? If you use staging or QA or some sort of test environment, give me like a thumbs up or like some sort of, all right, I'm assuming it's a lot of you, but actually testing environments are not the way to go because through my experience and my past, I've kind of gone through so many things, so many different circumstances as a test engineer. And I want to go through some of the things that have happened to me that I'm sure have happened to all of you as well. So first of all, staging environments are really expensive to maintain. So if you just take into account like a basic website architecture of web servers sitting in front of a number of application servers that query a database and then throw in a memory-based cache, you're looking at over $100,000 per year, and that's not taking into account the cost of software licenses, support, infrastructure costs. So this can add up, especially when you have like 4 or 5 staging environments. Your company is spending a lot of money in a place where you're not really building confidence of your features. Staging test results do not always match production test results. So this happened to me all the time. It happened to the developers I was working with all the time. So I would test a feature in staging and I would work so hard on testing every single requirement. And I went through all the documentation with the product owner, and I worked with my developers to fix all the bugs, and I made sure that my end-to-end tests were passing in staging. So I signed off on the feature, and I felt so good about it, and I launched the feature to production, and what happens? There's a bug, because these environments are different, plain and simple, so the test results are not always going to match. Production includes data that staging doesn't have, and this is probably one of the most important things to distinguish, is that you're never going to know the differences between your test environment and production until you test in production. Like, you don't know what the difference is until you test there, right? No one cares if staging is broken. So I can't tell you how many times I was I logged into staging to fix a bug, and staging is down. I get the 404 screen of death. So I ping the DevOps guy, but he doesn't answer. So I ping someone else, and they tell me to open an IT ticket. And then you have to get your manager to escalate the ticket. And meanwhile, I'm testing this really high priority ticket, and nobody seems to care. So no one is going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is broken. It's just, it doesn't have the same priority as production. The load in staging does not match production. So when you think of the number of people who use your staging environment versus your production environment, the difference is a lot. And because the load is different, the accuracy of speed and lag times is not going to be correct, right? And at the end of the day, I have never heard anyone speak highly of their staging environment. It just doesn't happen. But I know what you're thinking, like this is the meme that everyone thinks of when they think of testing in production, like what could go wrong. But what's the first thing that you do right after you deploy a feature to production? You go to production and you test it, right? Okay, so some more things I learned when I was doing my homework. So after this groundbreaking interview that I had where I learned about testing in production, I went home and I did a ton of homework, and I learned a bunch of things about testing in production that I didn't know about before. So, and these really make a difference. So testing in production only works when the whole team owns product quality. So it's not just the test engineer's job, or just the front-end engineer's job, or just the back-end engineer's job. It's the entire team's job to own product quality, because when you're working in a high-risk situation like testing in production, you really want to have this like team mentality, and it's really on the whole team. Testing in production only works when you test early and often, and this is generally better in terms of like all testing. The earlier you test, the earlier you find bugs and defects, and the earlier you'll provide a better user experience to your end users. And it only works when you trust your team and your product. So let's talk about that for a second. Companies don't test in production because of this fear and this lack of trust in their systems, right? And for the same reason, people refuse to engage in the tools and process changes that are going to generate that trust, right? People are scared when they think about testing in production. It's not like a common thing. It's not common practice yet, but it's a very scary topic, right? But I know that it's risky. I know it can affect real end users, and it can affect reporting and business decisions, and it can affect third parties. Like there's so many risks. I'm sure that you guys can think of more risks than these, but I think these are like some of the most important ones. But we're going to go through how to do this safely. We're going to address all of the risks together. So let's talk about how to set up testing in production. There's 4 steps of testing in production. The first step is to install all of the necessary tools. And the first tool that you need when you're testing in production is feature flagging. And feature flagging is really the key. It's a way to decide who sees which features at what time. So basically you can hide, enable, or disable a feature at runtime. And this is kind of what it looks like in my head. So our developers would create a feature flag from the UI and then target all of our internal teammates. So this is dev, QA, product, design, all of our automation bots. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by the users that are inside of this feature flag. So since the default is off right now, the toggle is to the left, it means that the people on the right, the real end users, they can't see anything related to the feature. So only the people who are targeted will be able to access the feature, will be able to test the feature, will be able to have anything to do with that feature. So if there happens to be a bug in your new feature, it has no impact on your end users because they don't have access to it. So In case something happens, there's a bug, only the people who are targeted will be able to see the bugs and fix it. And again, it has no impact on your end users because they are not targeted. So while the feature flag is off, this is when you go in as a team and you test internally with your teammates. So you kind of dog food. You verify all the proper functionality, you fix all the bugs, you work with the entire dev team, make sure it's working in production. Again, we're not using a test environment here to test separately. This is in production while the feature flag is off. This is where you go in and you make sure everything works. And then once you know your feature is working in production, it looks good, you turn on the flag already knowing 100% your features are working in production and you didn't break anything that was existing. And now your users are happy and they're dancing because they have a perfect feature. You didn't release any bugs because you were able to test in the same environment that your users will be working in. And then you repeat this process with every new feature. So each feature has its own feature flag. And this is kind of the release process that testing in production really thrives on. But with that comes a little bit of responsibility because it can be overwhelming when you have a lot of flags and you don't know which combinations to test, especially as a product person, as a test engineer. You want to know which combinations of flags to test, what if they overlap, what if there's functionality that kind of overlaps with one flag and another flag. So the best thing to do is work with your product owner to prioritize what the most important flows are, and together with your data analyst, figure out what your users are doing the most, and then choose what the most important flows are that need to be automated. And then after you feel comfortable and you know that release went smoothly, you want to delete the flag both in the UI and the code because you do not want stale code. So I'm going to show you how to do this in the Split UI. It's pretty intuitive. You just go to Split.io, you hit create split, and basically split is another name for feature flag. And then the first thing you need to do is name your flag, which you're going to include in your code, which I'll show you in a second, and then select a traffic type. Now, traffic type defines what differentiates the people who see your feature and the people who don't see your feature. So this can be device, if you only want to release the feature to Android users or only to iOS users. For testing and production purposes, I suggest selecting user as traffic type just so that you can use your internal teammates, like I said, target them, test it with your internal team, and then release it. So once you create the flag, you are going to set up your targeting rules. And again, targeting rules are going to say who sees your feature and who doesn't. So here I'm saying I want myself, developers, product, designers, my test user. This is my automation robot, which I use for my automation scripts. All of them are targeted, and then you can see on the bottom that the default rule is off. So if you're not on this list, you don't see my really cool feature, you see the existing behavior. So in the code, I say if the user is in the flag, then you're going to give them treatment on. So let them see this really cool feature. And if not, then you're going to give them the existing treatment. And then in my test, I'm logging in as this test user, this robot that I targeted, and then I'm going to go to some page, perform whatever actions, and then I'm going to expect this really cool feature to work because this robot is targeted in the test. And what's really cool about targeting your test users inside of the feature flags is that these tests can keep running even when you turn the feature flag on, because you won't need to change any configurations because you added these users before the flag was on. And again, the cherry on top of the cake here is that when you turn on the feature flag in production, you already know that the feature is working, so there are no surprises. Okay, so the next tool that you need after feature flagging is an automation framework. And basically you need an automation framework because it's just not scalable to test everything manually. So you want one that's easy to adopt, easy to debug, one that has good reporting, and one that has a good support community. And then you also just want a job scheduler that's going to run the tests for you. This can be a cron job or through something like Jenkins. I also don't recommend running the tests in a loop. I think you should run the test to run in your builds pipeline every time someone pushes up new code. You also want to have an alerting tool, and you want the alerting tool to be integrated with your job scheduler. And again, everyone on the team owns product quality, so everyone gets to be on call. So this is a summary of all the tools that I've used for testing in production. So I'll stop in case anyone wants to like take a screenshot or something. Okay, so the next step after you have all of your tools is to carefully create your test data. And I'm going to go a little bit faster because I just hit the 5-minute mark. So when you're testing in production, like the biggest risk, in my opinion, is you don't want to affect real end users, right? Like you don't want what you're doing to affect like a real end user in production. So you want to create and manipulate test data without affecting real end users. So something that we did was we created a consistent naming convention for all of our test users, which these people acted like real users and looked like real users, but only we would be able to interact with them. So the way that you identify these people is that you have a Boolean, something like is test user or is test, and you set that to true for all of your test users. And then in your data dashboard, if you're using Datadog or Looker or whatever it is, you can exclude all actions by users whose is test user Boolean is set to true. So you can separate these two things and make sure that your business decisions are not being made from, test data. And then you have a back-end flagging system used to identify all of your testing entities. So if the flag is on, you know that this page or this object or this thing is a test entity, and it should not be included in any data or analytics. And basically, each team is going to have their own specific predetermined guidelines. So you'll work with your team and you'll say, you want this specific flow to have this setting, so I need to create test objects in these places. Each team is going to be a little bit different, but it's just important to have these ahead of time. Okay, and the next step is to write your tests. I like BDD because it's easy to read and easy to write. It's easy to understand like what's going on after a test fails. When handling third parties, if your software is integrated with a third party, what's worked best for me is to have a header in the API request that you send to the third party, and then work with the third party and say, hey, any request that you get from this header is coming from a test, so I want you to handle it differently, and tell them what you want. So I've done this a few times, and I've never had a problem with this. It's also important to have alerts set up for your setup and teardown. So if any step fails, whether it's the cleanup or the login or the actual test, you want to immediately get alerted. And then the last step is to deploy to a production canary. And what a production canary does is it minimizes the risk if something goes wrong. So it allows you to roll out a change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to the entire population. And this, again, just provides risk mitigation. In case something does go wrong, would you want 100% of your users to identify and encounter the issue, or 1%? And I just think infrastructure and configuration changes should always be released with a canary. This is what it looks like in the UI. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so again, for risk mitigation, before launch, use feature flags to target your users, and after launch, use production canaries to limit your audience in case something goes wrong. And the outcome of this process was that our developers, our entire team, had higher confidence, increased developer velocity. Like, we knew our features were working ahead of time. We were able to ship stuff faster. It minimized the user interaction with bugs and defects, and it ensured a great user experience. Testing in production promotes a really proactive engineering culture. Like, I don't want to wait until something breaks, have a user report it to me, and then fix it. I want to find out what's going on and fix any issues before anyone ever sees anything wrong. I am going to skip this part, but basically, if you cannot test in production, I suggest testing in a containerized environment. I can answer questions about this later. I'm going to skip this too. Okay, cool. So there's always going to be those people who say testing in production will never work. There's always going to be those people who say, staging is just the way to go. And to those people, I say three things. First, staging will never fully represent production. Staging is a sunk cost. And these people are not my target audience. They're either going to get on board or die off. So if this is something that you wanted to try, this is kind of like how I summarize the steps. So install your tools, create your test data, write your tests, launch behind a feature flag, deploy to a production canary, and have a drink. So in case you haven't been paying attention at all the past 20 minutes, I want you to walk away with two things from this talk. The first is no one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. The second is that the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Again, I'm Talia. This is my Twitter and my email. I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, Talia, thank you so much for your presentation. That was awesome. And honestly, it's things that we all know that we should be doing and just very often don't because we're scared, like you said, or there's someone above us telling us no, we shouldn't do that, and we don't want to argue it, or there are just so many reasons that we might go and say no, we're not going to do that. Just a reminder, if you want to ask Talia any questions, feel free to put them in the stage chat, and I'll read them live here on the stage. The first one that we have is from David Anderson. His question is, what is your suggestion for an environment flow? Would you still have a dev QA production flow, or would you have just production, or would you have something else entirely?
Yeah, so I still suggest not immediately killing your staging environment. I kind of skipped over this in the presentation because I didn't have enough time, but you can still use your staging environment because there's data and privacy things like GDPR and what's the other SOX. There's things that prevent certain flows from being tested in production. So for those reasons, you can use a staging environment because sometimes legal, this has happened to me a few times where legal will get involved and say, you just can't do this in production. So for those specific flows, you can use, your QA event, your QA environment or staging environment. But, for the important user flows, you should be using production. So for that, I would suggest Dev QA Prod for your environments.
So how can I test some risky type things in production where maybe I don't explicitly really want to do a thing? An example that I've got is charging a credit card if I'm testing a checkout process. What are some ways that I can either stub that out in production or short circuit that in production or do something to test that whole workflow but not do the risky thing?
Yeah, someone just crossed their fingers. Yeah, you just cross your fingers and hope it works. Okay, so what I would suggest in terms of this is something I get asked all the time is if I have a retail site and I want to make sure that the checkout flow works, something you can do is have a test credit card, have a test, some sort of test account, and use that for all of your purchases. And then in your teardown, make sure that you get a refund on that card. So make sure that whatever you test is being processed, and the correct amount was deducted, and the actual flow works. Once you know that works, then you can refund it in the teardown for that test. Another thing you can do is work with whoever's processing the payment. If it's Visa or whatever company is processing the payment, work with them, and that's another third-party flow. And just say if you get any requests from this credit card, it's a test. So make sure that you do whatever, do this other thing, don't actually charge the card or charge it and then refund it. You can work with the third party, and this would be a good case for that.
Cool. Let's say my QA team wants to start testing in production. It's not a thing that we do today, but it's a thing that we all know that we want to do. What kind of resistance are we going to expect to get? And what are some ways we can push past that?
All of it. Expect all of it. Are my slides still being shown? Can I? Okay, I'm gonna scroll back in my slides real quick because I had this. Okay, basically, if this is something that you wanted to implement, and a lot of times engineers come to me and they're like, how do I do this? I want to do this. How do I get started? So basically, I would first suggest explain why the pros outweigh the cons for your specific team. So is your staging environment unreliable? Which, yes, it is. I've never seen a staging environment that was an exact replica of production that acted exactly the same as production. Are there frequently issues that you think could have been caught if you were testing in production, if you were using feature flags? And then this is kind of the biggest thing, is use examples from the past. So just how I had specific examples of like times when I went in and, you know, staging was down and I really had to test something, or things didn't work the same in production and staging for me. Like, use examples from your past and from your team's past. I think that plays like the biggest factor, and then just propose a path forward. So if you've never used feature flags, like go to split.io, there you can create a free account, play around with it. You can, just like propose a path forward. Like, ask your sprint team if like this is something that they would be interested in trying out. That's what I would suggest.
Very cool. Thank you. I have a question from Pablo. His question is, how much do you use data-based routing to mocks for third parties?
So it just depends on the flow. So it depends how many third parties are integrated and what they're willing to do. So I've worked with third parties that have said, we're absolutely not doing this for you. Like, you need to figure this out on your own. And then I've worked with third parties that are like, oh, whatever you need, we'll make this change for you. You don't want to deviate too much from like how the flow works in production. But as much as you can to replicate what's going on in production, you want to work with a third party and make sure that everyone knows ahead of time like what's going to be done. You don't want to make something completely different with your third party, because then you're kind of deviating from the point of testing and production a little. So I would say it just depends on the flow, and it depends on what your third party is willing to do.
Got it. You had touched on this a little bit because you had mentioned BDD test strategies. Does test-driven development apply to testing and production if we can't test until after deployment? Are there other workflows? Does it get modified a little bit, that workflow, or how does that work?
Yeah, so absolutely you can use TDD. So what would happen in that case is when you're writing the test, you would write the test and then run them in production behind the feature flag. So in this case, you just want to make sure that the feature flag is off and that your test users are targeted in the feature flag, so that when you run the test, they're still getting the experience. It's just not available to everyone in the real world yet. And then as you add more tests for that feature, just make sure that the feature flag stays off. And then once it's ready, you can turn the feature flag on again.
Cool. We've talked almost, I don't want to say exclusively about functional testing, but we've also done a good amount of talking about just sort of feature flagging off features. And that doesn't really speak to, the non-functional test. So should we load test in production too, or is that a totally different beast?
Yeah. Okay. So performance testing and load testing in production is like absolutely necessary. Like, I don't recommend doing this in staging at all, because when things happen, you want to be prepared for them. So what I recommend for performance testing is just making sure that you do it at a time with low traffic. So like, I've had to wake up at like 3 a.m. my time and like run a load test in production. Like, you just want to make sure you do it at a time of low traffic and just be prepared for outages. Like, you want to make sure that if something goes wrong, like, you'll know what to do. And doing these regularly, I think, is a really good practice, especially like if you have a retail site, like before big sales, before, like Black Friday and, the day after Christmas and the times that there's like a lot of traffic on your site. But absolutely, you can run them in production. You should run them in production. Again, like, I don't care if it works in staging. I care if it works in production. So. Right.
And I think speaking to, you said, be ready to troubleshoot if something does go wrong, but inevitably something might fail. And what that's, at least in my mind, what might happen is you're going to get that one person who will say once and never again. So how can we rebuild trust if production testing caused an issue in the past?
Yeah, so the biggest thing here is, so there's two things. One is to go with, make sure you're using a canary release. So instead of just going from 0% to 100%, go from 0% traffic to 1%. Make sure it works for the 1%. If there's something wrong, roll it back. So make sure you're using a canary release. You can also do something like an AA test if you want to make sure that like your feature flagging framework is working correctly. Like you can use Split and do an AA test. So that what that means is that you'll give yourself, like everyone who's internal to the flag and everyone who's external to the flag, the same experience, and then make sure that your data shows the same thing because everyone's getting the same experience. So you can AA test, you can use canary releases. Feature flags really provide the most amount of risk mitigation. So if something goes wrong, you'll be able to catch it pretty early in the process. And if not, you'll catch it within the canary release. I wouldn't recommend just turning something on in production for everyone at 100% right away, especially if you've never used feature flags, but also you just don't know what the experience is going to be for everyone. It could be like a specific segment of users that have a different experience. So I would suggest, like, highly recommend canary releases.
Cool. We've got one more question from the audience, and it's about feature flags and complexity. So the question is, feature flags add complexity to the branches of your app, and doesn't that therefore add complexity to your tests? And follow on to that is, how do you mirror branching logic in tests with the feature flagging in app code?
Okay, so the first question was feature flags and complexity, right?
Yes, yes. So I can repeat it again if you want, but it's around added complexity to both the app and the tests.
Okay, so in terms of the app, basically feature flags just add an if-else statement. So you're saying, like, if you're targeted, if you're in this flag, give me this specific experience, and if you're not targeted, you're going to get this other experience. So it is an if-else statement. There's a lot of other stuff that you can do with it that'll add a little bit more complexity, but feature flags are not meant to last forever. They're meant to last, a certain amount of time, in maybe, I would say, like, not more than a couple months. And after that time, they're meant to be deleted. So they're meant to test out your feature, especially with testing in production. Like, you want to test out your feature, make sure it works, and then after you gradually release it to everyone, delete the feature flag. You don't need it anymore. So they're not meant to last a long time. So they do add a little bit of complexity, but for that specific period of time, to mitigate the risk of testing in production, I think it's worth it. And then the second part was about feature flagging different branches, right?
Right.
So yeah, the way that I would do that is kind of what I talked about before, about picking the combinations of feature flags that you want to test. So generally, if you have like one branch per feature, you'll have one user for each feature as well, and then just choose the combinations of flags that you want to have those users targeted in, and then that's how you know which combinations of flags to test.
Cool. If anybody else has any more questions they'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the stage chat. I personally have a question. This is just one that I have of my own volition. Do you have a sort of sweet spot for the number of parallel feature flags you should have active at any one time? Because I personally feel way too many in play all at once that just leads to chaos. So is there a correct number?
There is not a correct number, and this is because some companies that we work with have, thousands of feature flags at a time, and some companies have 10. So it depends on your team, it depends on your sprint cycle, but I don't suggest having a lot at a time. It's just really important to have a maintenance schedule and say, like, this flag needs to be deleted as soon as you hit 100%, and this flag have a sunset schedule for each flag, just because you don't want them to sit there and like take up space in your code base. Like that's just stale code that's not going to be used. So having a maintenance schedule is really important. So there's not like a magic number. I wish there was. I've seen that too, but just make sure that you have the correct maintenance in place.
Got it. Well, that brings us to time, but thank you so much for thank you so much for coming to present. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.